Nearly 4,000 years ago, in the Mesopotamian city of Mari, a scribe produced a receipt for 1 gur of dates and 10 sila of pistachios for making mersu, meal of the king. So using this receipt and other ancient tablets, I am recreating mersu, history's oldest recorded dessert. So thank you to Wildgrain for sponsoring this video as we make mersu for the king of Mari, this time on Tasting History. Mersu is the oldest dessert that we have any written record of, but it remains almost a complete mystery, partly because there are many different varieties of mersu, and partly because the information that we do have is absolutely incomplete. Take that receipt. Many people have recreated this dish based only on that receipt of pistachios and dates. They're usually ground up and then formed into a ball. And that could be the way that some mersu was made. Anyone who can confirm or deny it died well over 3,000 years ago. But I think it's only part of the recipe, because this is a receipt. And so it's like if you were going to make a German chocolate cake and you had most of the main ingredients for a cake at home, but to make it a German chocolate cake, you needed to go to the store to get coconut and chocolate. Well, 3,000 years into the future, somebody finds that receipt and says, oh, German chocolate cake. It's made out of chocolate and coconut. Well, no, not exactly, and I kind of think that's what's going on here. See, there are other sources from the period that refer to mersu as ninda mersu, ninda meaning bread. So was this some sort of bread or pastry or cake? There are also other sources that talk about it being made with flour and a sort of liquid, either water or milk or beer or some sort of melted fat, like clarified butter. Then there are others that mention flavorings like apples, figs, raisins, cumin, coriander, or even onion and garlic. Finally, I think that the dish had to have been more complex than just pistachios and dates because the king that it was being made for, Zimri Lim, employed 8 shamersim, or specialists in the art of making mersu. So were these people more like confectioners or even pastry chefs? It's really hard to know, but the fact that there were 8 of them working in the city makes me think that it was definitely complex work. And now the instructions that Wildgrain says for baking are excellent. The instructions on that cuneiform tablet to make the mersu, less than excellent. But even so, here is one possible version of Zimri Lim's mersu, for which you will need 2/3 cup or 150 grams of ghee or clarified butter that's been allowed to solidify, 1½ teaspoons of ground coriander seed, 2½ cups or 300 grams of emmer flour. Now you can use regular bread flour, it'll actually make the process a lot easier for you, but emmer or barley would have been what was used at the time, so that's what I'm using. And that dough is going to make something like a pie crust today. It's not going to be particularly sweet, but the filling is sweet. But if you do want the outside to be sweet as well, you can add some date syrup or honey, about 1/2 cup. For the filling, you'll need 1 cup or 150 grams of pitted dates and 1/2 cup or 75 grams of shelled pistachios. So first prepare the dough by mixing the coriander into the flour and then adding the ghee and working it in until everything comes together. If you find that it's not coming together, then add a bit of cold water until it does. It's really going to vary depending on what kind of flour you use. Since I'm using stone ground emmer, it really does not want to absorb the ghee and kind of work together. So it took me about 5 minutes of working the dough to really make it come together, and I didn't need any water. But if you're using bread flour, it'll probably only take about a minute to get it to come together, and you might need a little bit of water. You can also add the date syrup or the honey here if you're going to use it. Once the dough has come together, let it sit for an hour to several hours so the flour can really absorb the ghee or the clarified butter. And if you don't want to use clarified butter, then one of the other fats that was very popular at this time was the fat from a fat tail sheep. I wish I could get my hands on some of that fat tail sheep fat, but I haven't been able to. But one of these days, I'm going to use that fat. But regardless of whatever fat you use, while the dough rests, you can prepare your filling. So grind the pistachios in a mortar, not so much that they're pulverized, but enough that there are just bits of nuts left. Then mash the dates in a mortar as well. It is a very sticky business, so you can also use a food processor if you like, but essentially what you want in the end is a date paste that will easily combine with the nuts. And in a bowl, you're going to do just that. Mash the dates and the nuts together until the nuts are all well incorporated into the dates. Then divide the paste into 18 pieces and roll them into little balls or patties. And essentially what you have is that form of mersu that you would get if you just used the ingredients in the receipt from Zimri's palace. And they're very simple. They are quite delicious, a little sticky, but very, very good. And there is something today made in the region called medguka, which is similar, very, very similar to these. But I think that the mersu that was popular at the time was a little bit more complicated, so we got a few steps left. So take the rested dough and divide it also into 18 pieces and form each piece into a flattened patty in your hand, and then set one piece of the date and pistachio mixture into the center and wrap the dough around it. Now, unlike the dough of a pie crust, this does not stretch in the same way, especially if you're using emmer, which has very little gluten. So it's more of like a patchwork, like you're plastering it around the center of the filling. Then you flatten the mersu a bit and set them on a baking sheet and decorate, if you'd like, with a few pistachios on top. Then set them in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius, and bake for 15 to 18 minutes or until they're browned on top. Also, a huge thank you to my friend Arim, who helped me with a lot of the research for this video, and he actually has another slightly different version of this recipe in his upcoming book, which he's working on, called Table of Gods. I'll put a link to that in the description. His research is excellent. And like I said, the one that I'm making today is just one possible version of this dish, though there is a modern equivalent, sort of. It's called ma'amul, and it's essentially a butter cookie made with a semolina that is filled with different things like dates and pistachios. But honestly, it could be something absolutely completely different. It could be a layered cake or some sort of even more complex pastry. It could even be like a porridge. We really don't know. Anyone who does know has been dead for a very long time. What we do know is that they were very well liked during the period. They were around for a long time, and one of the people who really loved them was the king of Mari, a man named Zimri Lim. The city of Mari, founded around the year 2900 BC, was situated along the waterways of the Euphrates, allowing it to control the major trade route between the cities of Sumer to the south and those of the Levant to the north. And for the next 1,000 years, it passed through the hands of numerous civilizations, but eventually ended up being controlled by the Amorites under the Lim dynasty, where it flourished. And by the time Zimri Lim was born in the 18th century BC, Mari was the commercial hub of the region, a walled city with a massive palace along the river. And Zimri Lim grew up at that palace because he was the son, or the grandson, or the nephew, nobody really knows for sure, of the then king of Mari, Yadumlim. But Zimri Lim had to flee the palace and go into exile when he was relatively young because Yadumlim was killed in a palace coup, possibly by another one of his sons, who then 2 years later was assassinated. And after that, the city of Mari was taken over by the powerful king of Assur, Shamshi-Adad, who styled himself the king of the universe and pacifier of the land between Tigris and Euphrates. Now, Shamshi-Adad had two sons. There was the elder son, Ishme-Dagan, who was the golden child, and the younger son, Yazma-Adad, who was the screw-up of the family. Yet both sons received a city in their father's burgeoning empire. Ishme-Dagan got the city of Ekalatum, and Yazma-Adad, the screw-up, got Mari. And what I love about this period was they wrote everything down, and they wrote it down on clay tablets which have survived the ages. So we actually have a lot of correspondence from this period from Shamshi-Adad to his sons. And he doesn't seem to have thought very highly of his youngest son, the screw-up. See, shortly after he became king of Mari, Yazma-Adad decided that he wanted to build 6 statues to numerous gods. But he wanted to build them out of gold and silver, which was not in the budget. And they would need a lot of sacrifices to keep them happy, also not in the budget. So his father wrote to him, "These gods that you plan to make require 1 month of festival sacrifices." What? Where are the oxen and sheep that you must keep providing for sacrifices at festivals? Here you keep writing to me saying, "I have no sheep or lambs." Yet you would still fill the town with gods here, when however many sheep now available hardly suffice for a sacrifice to them. On top of his financial immaturity, Yazma Adad didn't seem to actually care for the major work that a king needs to do, like settling local disputes, handling the administration of the city, or leading armies. He much preferred the fun parts of being a king, like drinking and eating too much, carousing and dancing, that sort of thing. So his father sent another letter. "How long shall we govern you? Are you truly a child? Are you not an adult? Is there no beard on your chin? How long will you neglect the administration of your house? Don't you see that your brother is leading vast armies? So as for you, lead your palace and your house. Why can't you be more like your brother? I swear, 4,000 years, and parents really haven't changed. Nothing's really changed." But turns out that this golden child, the elder brother, was maybe not so much of a golden child, because he left the whole empire to that eldest son, Ishme-Dagan, who almost immediately let the empire start falling apart. And one of the first things to go was the city of Mari. See, Zimri-Lim this entire time had been in exile at the court of the king of Yamad, another of the Lim dynasty, Yarim-Lim I. And as soon as Shamshi-Adad had died, Yarim was like, "Hey, Zimri, let's go get your father's city back, the one that had been taken from your family so many years before." And with his army, that's exactly what they did. They either killed or at least kicked out the ne'er-do-well son. We don't really hear about him ever again. And Zimri was finally put on the throne. And it was during his reign that Mari was really at its height. He expanded the palace to over 260 rooms, which included a grand throne room that was 82 feet long, a treasury, a temple, an expansive residence, as well as a complex for bathing, numerous kitchens and food storage rooms, and there was also the palace archives, filled with cuneiform tablets documenting the goings-on of the kings of Mari. And it's because of these archives that we know so much about this period in this part of the world. And one of the clay tablets found is the one that we're working from today, a receipt which said 1 gur of dates and 10 sila of pistachios for making mersu, meal of the king. And it was even dated, the 14th of the month of Kiskisu of the year that followed the seizing of Ashlaka by the king Zimri-Lim. Other tablets from the archives tell of foods like lentils, chickpeas, breads, and porridges being received, meats of pig, fish, and fowl from small birds to ostriches. In the kitchens were found numerous molds for cakes or breads that were in the shapes of different animals and gods. There are records of many different fruits and vegetables and dairy products being served, as well as a drink called alap anu, which was a beer made from fermented pomegranate. Something I would love to make one day here on the channel. What's really cool though is that this drink, as well as the beer and wine being served, was often served chilled with ice. Now you don't usually think of Mesopotamia having a lot of ice, but at this period, in this location, they did. It was documented that Zimri-Lim, son of Yadun-Lim, son of Mari, Tut-ul, and the land of nomads, maker of a storehouse for ice that no king since time immemorial had built on the banks of the Euphrates, to which I had ice transported, building a storehouse in Turka. Ice from the mountains to the north would actually be brought down and then kept cold for months at a time in these storehouses that Zimri-Lim made. He actually made 3 of them. But unfortunately, Zimri-Lim did not get to often enjoy the chilled wine and the mersu and the other molded cakes that were being had at the palace, because while he was there, at times, he was often out on campaign. He was out fighting Ishme-Dagan, trying to get back all of the lands which Shamshi-Adad had taken from his family. And like I said, Ishme-Dagan, who was the golden child to his father, was finding it hard to hold on to his father's lands, and Zimri-Lim was finding it quite easy to take them back. There is a wonderful letter by Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, that shows this change in fortunes. See, at the time, there were many kings in the region, and there were kind of different levels. There were the upper level of kings, and they called themselves brothers, brother kings. And then there was another level of vassal kings that those higher kings called their sons. Well, originally Ishme-Dagan was the brother to Hammurabi. They were on the same level, and then Zimri-Lim was actually a son or a vassal king to Ishme-Dagan. But after a series of poor performances by Ishme-Dagan, everything changed. Hammurabi wrote to him saying, "To Zimri-Lim, who writes me as a brother, you, Ishme, write as a son." Essentially saying, Zimri-Lim, who should have been your vassal, is now my equal, and you are his vassal. So yeah, that must have hurt. And obviously, Ishme-Dagan did not appreciate this demotion, and so he angrily wrote back to Hammurabi, "You made me write Zimri-Lim as son? Is that man not my servant? He is not sitting on a throne of his own majesty." But as far as we know, Hammurabi never even bothered to write the guy back. For him, Zimri-Lim was now the main man in the region, and so it was with him that Hammurabi made an alliance, both militarily and for trade. On one of the many occasions that Zimri-Lim was out on campaign, he wrote back to one of his wives in Mari, who he had put in charge of the food and wine storehouses, saying, "Hammurabi, king of Babylon, has written to me for wine. Open up the wine stockroom with Sid-Kummasi standing by, let him purify his hands, then select 11 jars of red wine of good quality that I drink. Mix it in one vat, fill up 10 jars of red wine, seal them with this seal I have sent, and give them to Badi-Lim to take to Hammurabi. Then convey to me 1 jar of the red wine that you are mixing, sending it upstream." There's actually a lot of correspondence that we have between Zimri-Lim and the many women that he had in his life, because he had no fewer than 4 wives, probably more, and at least 11 daughters, and he held them all in very high esteem. He often put his wives in charge of different aspects of the city while he was gone, including his main wife, Shiptu, who he basically put in charge of the whole city, of the whole administration, which was not common during this period. Not only was Queen Shiptu put in charge of the day-to-day goings-on of the city, she was also put in charge of conveying messages to Zimri-Lim from the gods. Often these were dreams from prophets, usually induced by some sort of chemical, potion that they would drink. But she would have these dreams written down, and these prophecies would then be sent to Zimri-Lim, usually on the battlefield, so most of them have to do with warfare, saying, "Oh, you're going to win this," or something else that would allow him to strategize. One prophecy that the queen sent him actually had to do with the victory over his rival, Ishme-Dagan, and it wouldn't even require an actual battle. "For there will not be a battle. As it nears, his allies will be scattered. Ishme-Dagan's head will be cut and placed at my lord's feet." But sometimes even the gods got things wrong, because that is not how it went down. And unfortunately, when the gods got things wrong, they got them really wrong. See, over the years, Zimri-Lim and Hammurabi's alliance had started to have some issues, partly because Hammurabi was becoming very dominant and a little too aggressive, even with his neighbors near Babylon, and Zimri-Lim was like, maybe I don't want to help this guy so much anymore, because maybe he'll come after me. So he asked his wife to ask the gods about this. "For now, inquire about Hammurabi of Babylon. Will this man die? Will he be honest with us? Will he battle against us?" Well, she asked the gods, and she got an answer back, so she wrote to her husband. "This man plots many things against this land, but he will not prevail. You will capture him and stand over him. His days are numbered. He will not live long." Well, not long after this, in 1763 BC, Hammurabi requested Zimri-Lim to help him fight the cities of Larsa to the south of Babylon. And Zimri-Lim didn't comply. Well, Hammurabi took over Larsa anyway, and when he had done so, he turned his sights on Mari. And just about a year later, in 1762 BC, Hammurabi conquered the city of Mari and probably killed Zimri-Lim, because we don't hear about him anymore from this point on. And it wasn't just Zimri-Lim who disappeared, it was the entire city of Mari itself, because Hammurabi went in, looted the city, especially the palace, and then set it all on fire. The palace burned, the top part collapsed and was destroyed, but ironically, the burning of the palace is what saved the palace for posterity, because the lower walls were all made out of mud, and so the fire basically turned them into brick. And so while most buildings from this period are nothing but the foundations, the walls of Mari still stand in places at 13 feet tall. So it's ironic because it was destroyed and yet preserved at the same time. But this is pretty much the last we hear of Mari in the historical record. What's unclear is why Hammurabi did this, because he usually, when he took over a city, incorporated it into the new Babylonian Empire. But he destroyed Mari, just wiped it off the face of the earth, essentially. And maybe it was because he was so mad at Zimri Lim and for what he saw as treachery, or maybe it was because Mari was quite a bit further north from Babylon, and so he thought maybe he couldn't control it because there were other cities in the Levant which wanted Mari as well. Nobody really knows, but it essentially disappeared until it was excavated in 1933. And this is when they found 20,000 clay tablets, one of which was a receipt for the ingredients of mersu. So once your mersu begins to brown on top, remove them from the oven and let them cool completely. And here we are, mersu from ancient Mesopotamia. Can I tell you, the entire time that I was filming this episode, all I could think of was that line from Aladdin where the street seller is like, sugared dates and figs, sugared dates and pistachios, because we've got sugar dates and pistachios. Here we go, let's try it. So it's interesting because the textures are so very different. The outside is like a very crumbly pie dough. You want to get it as thin as possible because this is too thick at the bottom, because it's just like eating pie crust, unsweetened pie crust in this version. But then the center is like chewy and rich and really sweet, with bits of the nuts left that kind of give it some nice texture. The center is wonderful. Together, they're really, really great. Like I said, I wish that I had gotten the pastry a little thinner. So you just gotta do that when you make them. But the flavors are wonderful. I love pistachios, I love dates, this is great. Really good. So whether you want to make the version with the crust on the outside, or if you just want to make the version that is the dates and pistachios, both are delicious. The dates and pistachios version, super, super simple, so there's no excuse not to do it. So go make some mersu, live like an ancient Mesopotamian king, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. One of the most famous names in the history of breakfast is John Harvey Kellogg, who made it his life's mission to heal the minds and bodies of America, albeit through some weird, even sadistic practices at times, including electroshock therapy and yogurt enemas. But one of the more tame curatives he promoted, and probably his most lasting legacy, was the invention of cornflakes, the breakfast cereal which I'll attempt to make using instructions from the original patent. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as I attempt to make the true cornflakes, this time on Tasting History. Now, in determining how I was going to make these original cornflakes, I looked to the patent from 1895, which is probably the earliest recipe for making these cornflakes. Now, it's very, very long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here are the bullet points. Patent number 558393 for flaked cereals and process of preparing same. First, soak the grains for some hours, say 8 to 12. Second, cook the grain thoroughly. For this purpose, it should be boiled in water for about an hour. Third, after boiling, the grain is then cooled and partially dried, then passed through cold rollers. The purpose of this process of rolling is to flatten the grain into extremely thin flakes, whereby the bran is broken into small particles. Fourth, after rolling the compressed grain of flakes, it is then baked or roasted in an oven until dry and crisp. And the patent doesn't just apply to corn. He says it could be corn or barley or wheat. In fact, I think wheat was the first thing that they used. But this is kind of where my dilemma is, because he talks about putting the entire grain or wheat berry or piece of corn through the roller to make it into a flake. And that description agrees with something that William Kellogg later wrote, saying that it came out in the form of large thin flakes, each individual wheat berry forming one flake. But in other descriptions, he talks about making it into a dough, which would require the grain to be broken up before putting it into the roller, so not entirely sure what was going on in that very first process, so I'm gonna try both and see which works best. Now, what is definite about that original 1895 version is that there was exactly one ingredient: corn or wheat or whatever grain you were using. There was no sugar, no salt, no nothing. It was bland, and it was supposed to be bland because Dr. John Harvey Kellogg said that the most bland plain foods were the most healthful. So for this recipe, I got 2.5 pounds or about 1 kilogram of corn. And Dr. Kellogg did say that it is the corn that was used in hominy grits, so it's a larger kernel rather than the small sweet corn, which might taste better, but I tried it and it makes for some teeny tiny flakes. So take the corn and cover it with water and soak it for about 12 hours. Now, Dr. Kellogg says that this should either be in cold water or hot water above 110 degrees so that it doesn't start to ferment. And so you can keep it in really hot water. I'm not exactly sure how you would do that. Or you can just do like I did and put it in the fridge overnight. So once your corn is nice and soaked, the patent says that it should be boiled. So drain the corn and add it to a pot, then fill it with water and bring it to a boil. Cover it up and boil for 1 hour or until it's nice and soft, and make sure to give it a stir every few minutes just to make sure it's not sticking to the bottom of the pot. Then once it's cooked, drain it again and leave it to cool and dry. And here's where I began testing different ways to recreate this recipe, because the patent talks about how each grain or kernel is supposed to turn into one flake. And they had these rollers that they would put them through that would mash them into a flake, and then they would scrape them off. I don't have those rollers. They're like industrial rollers, so I tried a few different things. One, I tried to put it through a pasta roller. That did not work, and I almost broke my pasta roller. I tried rolling them out with a rolling pin. Not really, so I ended up just kind of mashing them, and it did make it into a flake, but then when I baked them, it really just turned into kind of like smashed popcorn. And I don't think that's right. So with almost an entire day of different versions all not working out, I decided I would have to go with a dough. So I put the corn into a food processor and ground it up. Not nearly as fine as cornmeal, but fine enough that when I added a little water, I got something resembling a dough that I could at least roll out fairly thin. So I put that into the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit, 220 Celsius, and toasted it for 15 minutes or until it was nice and crispy. Again, I know this is not going to look like the original version, but since the only ingredient is corn, it should at least taste like the original version. Now, before we finish up the recipe, we need to talk about something, and that is a story that has been going around on the internet for many years, saying that Kellogg's cornflakes were invented to stop people from pleasuring themselves. And while it is true that John Harvey Kellogg was obsessed with what he called the secret sin, claiming that the solitary vice made boys pale, scrawny, hollow-eyed, dull, and listless, and could lead to bad eyesight and even psychotic behavior, and while it is true that he had a lot of ways of dealing with this secret sin, including extreme pain to the region or just locking it up in a cage, it seems that making cornflakes was not one of these treatments. Rather, cornflakes was a way to get people to chew their food more and to just help with indigestion. Now, is that as exciting of a headline? No, it's not. But I promise you, the story of cornflakes is still really, really cool. While today we associate the name Kellogg with breakfast cereal, in the last decades of the 19th century, Kellogg's was synonymous with good health. As director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg was a health guru of the age. He published numerous books and pamphlets, all filled with ways to keep both your mind and body healthy. And so you had people like President William Howard Taft, Henry Ford, Amelia Earhart, and Thomas Edison all converging on Battle Creek to be healed via the treatments of Dr. Kellogg. Now, some of the treatments were pretty tame, things that you wouldn't bat an eye at today. Things like daily exercise, getting a good night's sleep, and a low-fat vegetarian diet of whole grains and other fiber-rich foods. And this was his cure for one of the most common maladies of the day, and that was bad indigestion. And when you look at the cookbooks of the late 19th century, you see that a lot of the food was like meat and gravy and cream sauce, so it's no wonder that people had a lot of indigestion. For things like seasonal depression, he prescribed light therapy or phototherapy. He also did things like thermotherapy, where he would subject you to rather extreme bouts of cold, and electroshock therapy, which, well, it's exactly what it sounds like. But these were all some of the more tame treatments that he had, and definitely not what he would become infamous for. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, one of his more infamous treatments was thrice daily enemas. And you could either have a yogurt enema, where you would eat a half pint of yogurt and then have the other half pint entered through a different hole, or a traditional water enema, but the water was pumped into you via a machine that he invented that pumped 15 liters of water per minute. That's a lot of water. He also used a number of machines that were meant to massage the bowels to get things moving, but they were vigorous massages, rather painful. He even had a slapping machine, which would literally slap the out of you. And it, again, was very painful and was meant to be, because pain was one of the ways that you could treat a lot of the mental issues that you might be having. That was especially true if he thought that the root of your issue was sex. And frankly, he believed that the root of pretty much all people's issues was sex. Now, best in his mind was to abstain from it altogether, which is what he and his wife of 4 decades did, having never ever consummated their marriage. And many of these beliefs stemmed from his version of the Seventh-day Adventist religion, which also informed many of his beliefs on diet. He often cites his personal religious views, which sometimes conflicted with the official views of the church, when discussing his views on diet, including complete abstention from meat, tobacco, alcohol, coffee, chocolate, or caffeine of any kind. Instead, he believed that a diet of grains and vegetables was the best way to keep a person healthy, both in mind and body. It was also important that this food that you were eating was very well chewed. And he got these ideas from someone who was dubbed the Great Masticator. Horace Fletcher, who, along with trying out a diet of nothing but potatoes for 58 days, also popularized Fletcherism. And this was a system that dictated what to eat, when to eat, and how to eat it, meaning how many times you needed to chew something before swallowing it. Usually this was 32 to 50 times, but there were foods that required more, and he said you should just stay away from them. Things like the shallot. When you eat a shallot, you're supposed to chew 720 times before swallowing. That's about 10 minutes of chewing before swallowing. Now, Dr. Kellogg took Fletcher's advice to heart and required all of his patients at the sanitarium to chew their food at least 40 times. And whilst they chewed, he sang a song, which started, "Chew, chew, chew, that is the thing to do. You may smile when you chew, but don't try to talk too. For perhaps you will choke and be sorry that you spoke." And it was this combination of a grain-heavy diet and the need to chew your food that birthed cornflakes. Now, cornflakes were not strictly the first breakfast cereal. That had been invented in 1863 by Dr. James Caleb Jackson. At his own sanitarium in New York, he had invented something called granula, and this was basically graham bread that was baked and dried to within an inch of its life, much like hardtack. This was then broken into little pieces and put in milk and left to soak overnight, though even after a night of soaking, it was supposed to be as hard as pebbles. And so this was the perfect food for Dr. Kellogg, he thought, so he basically just copied it, but instead of calling it granula, he called it granola, so he didn't get in any legal issues. Now, granola was incredibly flavorless and incredibly popular. His patients loved it, and he loved giving it to his patients. But it required a lot of chewing, so much so that it actually broke a woman's tooth at one point, and so he was on the lookout for something that wouldn't require as much chewing. Then he came across a man who had invented another new cereal, which was tasteless, difficult to chew, and like eating a whisk broom. The tasteless and whisk broom were great. Difficult to chew, not great. But something about it worked for him, because what it was wheat that was made into a sort of slurry and then pushed into little threads, kind of like a pasta extruder, and those threads would then be put together into like a little basket. And this was shredded wheat. Well, Kellogg wanted to buy the rights to shredded wheat, but he couldn't get them, and so he decided, well, I'll just make my own version, but I'll make it even easier to chew by making it into a flake. And this is where John's brother William enters the story. Except that actually William's been there the whole time. You just haven't noticed him because he has been in Dr. Kellogg's shadow the entire time. Basically, he has been his assistant and lackey for decades and has been made to do all sorts of things, not just taking notes and writing letters, but polishing his brother's white shoes and trimming his beard. It wasn't uncommon for William to work 120 hours a week and originally got $9 a week, which is like $275 in modern money. So now we have the two Kellogg brothers and John's wife, Ella, testing ways to make this grain into flaked cereal. And they test it for months. And finally, they figure out that if they soak the grain and boil it and then push it through these rollers and scrape it off, it comes out as flakes. And that is the version that is then patented. They call these flakes granos, and in 1895 they start serving them at the sanitarium, either plain or sometimes in milk or yogurt, which I guess is a better way of getting your yogurt than via enema. The brothers also began selling granos to former patients, shipping it out via mail order, and eventually they just had too much granos to make, and so Will asked his brother if they could build a small factory, and in 1897 they opened up the Sanitas Food Company, which began selling toasted cornflakes soon after. A much better name than granos, if you ask me, though they did not change the formula because Dr. Kellogg said that they should remain bland and tasteless because they were a health food. The problem was, while some people enjoyed cereal because of its health benefits, a lot of people in the country were wanting to have cold cereal because it was just easier than making breakfast. Hot porridges could take hours and hours to make, whereas breakfast cereal, put it in a bowl, you're ready to go. Well, William saw this potential and was like, we gotta change up the formula so we can get this into more households. But John said, absolutely not. We are not changing it. It's going to remain bland. And this left a big void in the cold cereal market for others to come in and fill. And one of those people was a former patient of Dr. Kellogg, a man named Charles Post. Post opened a factory also in Battle Creek where he produced a cereal based on Kellogg's granola, but he made the pieces much smaller and he added sugar, and he called it Grape Nuts. Over the next few years, Post and numerous others turned Battle Creek into a cereal Silicon Valley with dozens of cereal factories opening all over. Everyone was making money, everyone except William Kellogg, because by now he was pretty much running the cereal factory, except that his brother John was still calling all of the shots. Time and again, he asked his brother if they could change up the formula or at least start a national advertising campaign, and time and again, his brother said no. He didn't want to change anything, he saw it as a health food, and he didn't want his reputation tarnished. But one day, while John was on a trip to Europe, William decided to go rogue. He added salt, malt, and sugar, and people loved it, but not John. John hated it, and when he came back, he said, "How dare you mess with my food? Change it back." Well, William saw that he had made the right decision in changing the recipe, but John was never going to change his mind. And so he decided, you know what, I'm done, and he quit. And he decided he was going to take cornflakes and make them work on his own. But John owned most of the rights still, and he thwarted his brother at every turn. So after 6 months, William came back. And the reason that he came back was because the sanitarium burned down to the ground. And he saw that his brother needed help, and so he returned to his shadows to help him rebuild. And William was the financial brains in the family, so he was able to get the funds and rebuild the sanitarium bigger and better than it had been before. And you'd think that John would be grateful, but he wasn't. And what really must have stung was in the 3 years that they were rebuilding, William had to look just down the street to see Charles Post making money hand over fist making cereal. But after the sanitarium was rebuilt, William had a bit of a nest egg, but John did not. He had gone way into debt to rebuild the sanitarium, and William knew this. And so he used that against John, saying, "Hey, I know you need money. I will buy the rights to cornflakes from you." Well, John did not like this, but he needed the money, and so eventually he gave up the rights, and William made a clean break, and in 1906 opened a new factory for the new Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company. Now, William had several setbacks fairly early on. First, Charles Post started selling a new cereal that was basically cornflakes, but he called it Post Toasties. And the new cornflakes factory burned down. But despite these setbacks, the business actually flourished, namely due to the fact that William was excellent at marketing. He knew right away that people just needed to taste cornflakes to become customers. And so he started a national campaign that was a little risque for the time, that encouraged women to give the grocer a wink and see what you'll get. And what you would get, of course, would be a sample of cornflakes for free. It actually went so well, though, that just 6 months later he had to change the campaigns to stop winking. So Will's cereal company was flourishing, and John's sanitarium was also flourishing. And surely they could be happy for each other and let bygones be bygones, right? No. Instead, they sued each other over the rights to the name Kellogg when it came to cereal. And for 10 years, they battled in the courts. John claimed that he was the first to use Kellogg for a cereal, which he was, and he was the famous Kellogg. He was the doctor that everyone knew. But William said that he had basically turned Kellogg's into the country's biggest cereal producer and made the name a household name synonymous with cereal. And after 10 years, the courts sided with him, and so he changed the company's name in 1922 to the Kellogg Cereal Company. And from that point on, the brothers' fortunes really began to diverge. Will's company flourished, as we all know Kellogg's. But John's sanitarium began to lose popularity. Partly it was because his methods of healing kind of went by the wayside, and he really started focusing on eugenics and forced sterilization. Things got dark. But also, the Great Depression hit, and people just couldn't afford the luxury of the sanitarium. And so eventually, it did go into bankruptcy. And this is when John wrote a note to William. It was going to ask for money, but it was also a letter of reconciliation, a letter of apology for not just how they ended things, but all the decades of abuse that he had put upon his little brother. But there was no reconciliation because the letter never got to William, or at least didn't get there right then. Because while John dictated the letter, it was his assistant who wrote it down, and she felt that it was beneath her employer's dignity to apologize in such a manner, and so instead of sending the letter, she put it into a filing cabinet, and there it sat for 8 years, long after John had died, and they never really reconciled. They had met once, and it did not go well. Anyway, it wasn't for 8 years until somebody finally found this letter and gave it to William, but by then, it was too late. A sad end to the relationship of these two brothers who, in 1895, kicked off the cold cereal craze with cornflakes. The cornflakes that should be ready. So after 15 minutes, the dough should be well toasted, and you can break them up into little flakes, and they're ready to eat. And here we are, the original cornflakes from 1895. Sort of. They should taste like them, even though the process didn't quite nail it. One of these days I'll get those rollers. Anyway, like you said, I could eat them plain, and you know what? I will try one plain. Crispy. Bland, as they're supposed to be. But it tastes like a cornflake. The flavor is the same, it's just missing that little extra something, that extra something being sugar. But I wanted to put some milk on them just to see how it goes. And see if they maybe soften up a little bit. I'm sure eventually they will, but we don't have time to wait for my cereal to get soggy, so here we go. That's actually pretty good. Again, it tastes like cornflakes, just not quite as sweet. Add a little sugar in there, you got yourself some nice cereal. So would I recommend making these? No, I would not. It is way too much work the way that I did it, just not worth it. If you do want to make them, if you want to make your own though, just buy some like cornmeal, some stone ground cornmeal, and use that. Add a little sugar, add a little salt, and then bake them that way. And if you add a little bit more water, I think you can make an even finer flake. And if you have industrial rollers at home, then let me know how the original process goes. Need to get some industrial rollers. Anyway, don't forget to try some cold brew or other coffee at Trade, and I will see you next time on Tasting. Between my childhood and college, I can't tell you how many times I've burnt my tongue eating an over-microwave bowl of Chef Boyardee pasta. But after years of only trying the stuff in the can, today I am making the real Chef Boyardee's recipe for spaghetti alla Boyardee. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we explore the real yet rather mythical life of Chef Boyardee, this time on Tasting History.
Hello, may I come in? I am Chef Boyardee. Perhaps you have seen my picture on Chef Boyardee products at your grocer's.
That is Chef Hector Boyardee, the real man behind the Chef Boyardee brand. And before he got into the canned pasta game, he was making spaghetti dinners for the good people of Cleveland, Ohio. And it was these spaghetti dinners that really put him on the map. And after he started his famous brand, he put out a cookbook in the late 1930s. Famous Italian Dishes by Chef Hector Boyardee, through courtesy of Stop & Shop. And I think he's playing a little fast and loose with the phrase Italian dishes, as there are recipes for macaroni tamale loaf, chili con carne, and Mexican pancakes. But I suppose what made them Italian was that he incorporated his brand of Chef Boyardee Italian sauce in all of them. Now, figuring out exactly what his original spaghetti dinners tasted like is probably not really realistic at this point. But we can get an idea using his recipe for spaghetti alla Boyardee. But while the recipe tells you how to make the spaghetti, when it comes to the sauce, the real essence of the dish, he points you to use 1 7-ounce tin Chef Boyardee Italian style sauce. Not super helpful because you can't actually get that sauce anymore. But there is a light description of that sauce in the cookbook. It says it's a combination of tomatoes, government-inspected beef, fresh vegetables, and mushrooms. Not really a recipe that we can follow. But some years back, his great niece, Anna Boyardee, put out a collection of recipes from her family, and one of those recipes was called Uncle Hector's tomato sauce. So I think that's what we should probably use. So between the 1930s cookbook and her family's recipe, I think we are pretty much ready to make the famous spaghetti alla Boyardee, for which you will need 2 pounds or 1 kilogram of peeled tomatoes. Now you can use fresh tomatoes if they are in season. The thing is, they're not really in season right now where I live, and they would have really not been in season most of the year when Chef Boyardee was cooking, so he used canned tomatoes quite often. So that's what I'm using. 6 tablespoons or 90 milliliters of extra virgin olive oil, 1 cup of diced onion, a half cup of diced carrot, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon fresh pepper, 5 medium basil leaves sliced into strips, 1 pound or a half kilogram of lean ground beef, and a half cup of sliced mushrooms. Now you'll notice that this recipe has no garlic, which I thought was kind of odd, but it turns out the area of northern Italy where Chef Boyardee was born, well, they don't use garlic in their tomato sauce, so neither did he, at least at first. That said, if a clove of garlic happened to fall into your sauce, I won't tell anyone. So the first thing that we need to do is to make our sauce from the tomatoes. So chop them into small pieces and then put them with all the juice into either a food mill or a conical sieve. The idea is to mash them up and get all of the pulp and juice to separate from the seeds. If you do use a conical sieve, you'll want to get a pestle, a wooden pestle, because one, it's a lot easier, and two, if you don't have yours laying around and you decide to use a spatula, you might have to press so hard that you'll break the spatula, like I did. But once the tomatoes are sauced, heat the oil in a deep saucepan and add the chopped onion and sprinkle with about half of the salt. Then let them cook over a medium heat for about 3 minutes, and make sure the heat isn't so high that it burns the onions. Then add in the carrots and let this all cook for another 5 or 6 minutes or until the onions are soft and translucent. Then add in the meat, breaking it up into small bits, and sprinkle the rest of the salt and pepper over the meat and cook for 10 to 12 minutes or until it's no longer pink. Then comes the tomato sauce you made and the mushrooms, and stir it all together and then raise the heat a bit so it comes to a boil. Let it boil for just a few seconds and then reduce the heat to a simmer and then set the lid onto the pot, leaving it slightly ajar, and let it simmer for about 40 minutes. It'll start to thicken up and it'll also just become wonderfully aromatic during that time. After 40 minutes, add in your sliced basil, stir it in, return the lid, and let it cook for another 5 minutes. So that is what Chef Boyardee called his Italian-style sauce. And before we add it to some spaghetti, let's see just how that sauce made a young Chef Boyardee the most famous Italian in America. So I first learned that Chef Boyardee was not only a real person, but was from Cleveland by watching 30 Rock. See, there was an episode where Liz Lemon was fed up with the work and stress of New York City, so she decides to take an impromptu trip to Cleveland, or as Jack says, flee to the Cleve. And when she gets there, there's a whole song about how wonderful Cleveland is, and it includes the lyric, "Chef Boyardee was born here, you know." Well, it turns out I do know that that is actually not true, because Ettore Boiardi was actually born in Borgonova, Italy, outside of Piacenza in 1897. He was the middle of 3 brothers, all of whom would eventually work in the restaurant industry. But for Ettore, that work started when he was around 11 at the local restaurant La Croce Bianca, or the White Cross. Now, at such a young age, he was probably the one squashing tomatoes and cleaning up, but it did help him get his foot into the door of the restaurant industry. And according to his family, in the next few years, he left Piacenza and ended up working at some fancy restaurants in Paris and London. And then at the age of 16, he boarded the ship La Lorraine from France on his way to America. And according to records at Ellis Island, he arrived on May 9th, 1914, and he was going to New York City to join his brother Paolo. Now, usually I don't look up ships' manifests to corroborate details like when young Ettore would arrive in New York, but I did for this one because basically for the next 10 years of his life, everything is kind of suspect. There are a lot of versions of what goes on. Now, I'm not saying that anything was made up, but I'm not saying that anything wasn't either. Even his family's own account of his life has a lot of holes in it, and so it's kind of difficult to tell what actually happened. And I'll explain as we go. So young Ettore arrives in New York in 1914 to meet up with his brother Paolo, who had changed his name to Paul by that time, who was working in restaurants he'd come over some years before. He was working as a waiter at the Persian Room at the Plaza Hotel. Very swanky, and according to most versions, he was able to then get young Ettore, who started to go by Hector, he was able to get him a job in the kitchens. And some years later, when Mario came over from Italy, the youngest brother, he got him a job there as well. So all 3 Boiardi boys are working at the Plaza, and this is where the story starts to show its cracks. Some versions of the story say that after just a year or so, young Hector Boiardi became the head chef at the Plaza Hotel. And is it impossible for a young teenager from Italy to become the head chef at one of the most prestigious hotels in the world? No, it's not impossible, but there's no reason to think that this actually happened. There are no records that I could find that corroborate this. So who knows? His family actually tell a different story, saying that he left the Plaza fairly early on to become the head chef at an Italian restaurant called Barbetta, which was then and still is on 46th Street. So maybe that's true. Again, I couldn't find any records to confirm or deny it, but it makes a little bit more sense. Where things really start to fall apart is when he cooked for the president. See, according to most stories that you'll find online, at the age of just 17, he was headhunted from the plaza to go to work at the exclusive Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia. And there they put him in charge of catering their top events. And one of those events was the wedding reception for then President Woodrow Wilson. And this is the story that you find most everywhere, including on the official Chef Boyardee website. The only issue is that the president didn't get married there. See, Woodrow Wilson's first wife, Ellen, died while he was in office in 1914, and the following December, 1915, he remarried, this time to Edith Galt. So there was a wedding at that time, but it was in Washington, D.C., about 6 hours away from the hotel, and they kept it very small and very quiet, partially because it had only been a year since his first wife had died, and partially because there were rumors floating around that she and the president had the first wife murdered. It's not true, but still, they didn't want any extra publicity, so very, very small affair. But regardless of the size of the wedding, it did not take place at the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, though the president and his first wife, who was not murdered, wink wink, had actually visited that resort a year earlier, but it was at Easter of 1914, which was before Boyardee even got to the country. Slightly more plausible is the idea that Chef Boyardee organized a meal that the president held honoring troops returning from World War I. But again, the timeline doesn't really add up. That would have been some years later, and there doesn't seem to be any record of this happening, so maybe we just chalk it up to the chef's colorful origin story and leave it there. What is for certain is that at some point, Hector did leave the plaza and around 1917 arrived in Cleveland, Ohio to work as the head chef at the Hotel Winton. Then in 1924, he and his wife Helen, who he had met in Cleveland, decided to lean into the chef's Italian roots and open their own restaurant, Il Giardino d'Italia, the Garden of Italy. And he opened it in an area called not Little Italy, but Big Italy. And very quickly, their restaurant attracted not only other Italian immigrants, but those for whom Italian cuisine was something wholly new. See, things like pizza and lasagna were fairly new in the US, and were found mostly in big cities that had little or big Italies. And spaghetti with meat sauce, well, that was a bona fide treat in Cleveland, and that is what made Chef Boyardee famous. People would come into the restaurant, try it, enjoy it so much that they would ask for an extra portion to take home. So he would wash out old milk bottles and fill it with his sauce, then send that and some uncooked spaghetti home with the people, along with instructions on how to make the meal. And those instructions are basically the instructions that you find in the 1930s cookbook that we're cooking from today. Well, the story goes that one night in 1927, Maurice and Ava Weiner, who are a couple who own some local grocery stores, come in and enjoy it so much that they ask Chef Hector if they can sell it in their store. The chef agreed, but very quickly realized that just he and his wife making this sauce in their restaurant, it wasn't enough to keep up with demand. So the next year, in 1928, with the help of his brother Mario, they established the Chef Boyardee Food Company. And they opened up a little factory in Cleveland to make the sauce. They sold 3 sauces: Italian-style spaghetti sauce with meat, a meatless mushroom sauce, and a Naples-style spaghetti sauce that had a bit of spice. And they marketed them as 3 delightful flavors, used them alternately for a varied menu. They were an absolute hit, and before long they were being sold in stores all over the Midwest. The only issue was that the customers and the people who were actually selling the sauce, who worked for the chef, none of them could pronounce his name right. So he started spelling it out phonetically, Boyardee. And unfortunately, they didn't specify where the accent was, so Chef Boyardee quickly became Chef Boyardee. Now, it wasn't just sauce that they were selling, but an entire meal. Along with the can of tomato sauce, you got a box of dried spaghetti and a little canister of grated Parmesan cheese. It could be prepared in only 12 minutes and feed a family of 3 or 4 for only 29 cents. A perfect meal for a country which had just been plunged into the Great Depression. The product sold like gangbusters, and by the late 1930s they had outgrown the Cleveland factory, and so all 3 brothers got together and moved to Milton, Pennsylvania, where they opened a new factory where they could grow their own mushrooms, and they even put out ads for local farmers to switch to tomato production. The only ingredient that they did still import was the Parmesan cheese, which they had imported from Italy, and for much of the mid-20th century, they were the #1 importer of Parmesan to the US. Now, business was going swell, and they sold nationwide, but everything changed when the US entered World War II. See, the government was not equipped to provide rations to all of the soldiers going overseas, so much of the work was contracted out to companies like Hershey, Heinz, General Mills, and Pillsbury, and of course any company who was making canned foods. That meant Chef Boyardee was going to war. Almost overnight, production shifted to make rations, and they quickly became one of the top suppliers of product for C and K rations, with dishes like meatballs and spaghetti, Vienna sausage, beef stew, and chili con carne. They even provided rations for the Soviets fighting on the Eastern Front. And to meet demand, they had to hire a lot more employees, so they became the #1 employer in the area. And supposedly, they were given medals from both the US and the Soviet government for their work in supplying the troops with food. Of course, all of the stories have different medals being won, so I'm not entirely sure what it is, but suffice to say, their efforts were appreciated. Unfortunately, with the end of World War II, also came the end of that military contract, and so all of those new employees would have to be laid off. But what's cool is instead of doing this, the Boyardee brothers decided to sell to a much larger company in order to keep everyone employed. American Home Products took over production, but Chef Hector Boyardee himself did stay on as a consultant and the face of the brand, which was great because in 1953, he got on TV.
Hello, may I come in? Chef Boyardee's products are at Best Grocers.
Ask for Chef Boyardee's spaghetti dinner. Only about 15 cents a serving.
Over the next decades, Boyardee's face was everywhere, and his meals became the #1 selling Italian food in the country. Meals like his famous spaghetti, but also ravioli and pizza, though I'm curious exactly how it tasted because it didn't have melted mozzarella, and it was really just his sauce on crust with some Parmesan cheese grated on top. It was the 50s, and food was kind of weird, so they were lucky to have any pizza at all. Now, soon after this, they added what I think is the best addition to the brand, and that is beefaroni. It was always my favorite growing up. Now, eventually in 1978, Chef Hector Boyardee stepped away from the company, and he did pass away in 1985. Since his passing, the brand has changed hands a few times, and in doing so, they've changed the recipe of the sauce so it doesn't taste the same as when I was a kid. And it's not just because my palate has matured, it really does not taste the same. In fact, some years back, they released cans of what they called throwback recipes, which went back to the older recipe. But unfortunately, I haven't seen that around in years, so without being able to get my hands on some of Chef Hector's original Chef Boyardee sauce, I guess I'm going to just have to put the whole spaghetti dinner together myself. So the chef's 1930s recipe says to bring a gallon of water to a boil, then add 2 tablespoons of salt and 8 ounces of dried spaghetti. Then he says to cook the spaghetti for 12 minutes, stirring frequently. Once cooked, strain it, return it to the pot, then add 2 tablespoons of butter and 3 tablespoons of grated Parmesan cheese. Dish the spaghetti up with the sauce on top and sprinkle with more of his grated cheese, and here we are. Spaghetti alla Boyardee, the original spaghetti dinner. We'll give it a taste. It's phenomenal. I knew it would be because it's made the whole house just smell wonderful. But it's even better. The creaminess that you get from like the butter and cheese actually on the spaghetti, really like that. It is a relatively simple sauce. There is so much flavor coming out. What I really like, so you get a lot of the herb, like the basil, but you also get a sweetness, and there's no sugar added into this. And a lot of tomato sauces now add sugar, but if you cook it long enough with good tomatoes, even if they're canned, the sweetness comes from that. So you don't need to add sugar. This is really fantastic. I will be eating this entire thing, and I'm gonna be making this again. This is actually something I would make like just cause it's Thursday night. So go ahead, make this. It's wonderful, wonderful spaghetti sauce, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Back in my day, the cool thing to eat at school lunch was a Lunchable. But in 1934, it was peanut butter and tomato soup, a butter sandwich, a hermit cookie, and an apple and milk. So thank you to Wondrium for sponsoring this video as we make school lunch from the Great Depression, this time on Tasting History. So using an old menu from 1934, I'm going to put together an entire meal for a school lunch today, but really there are only two things I have to make, and that's the peanut butter and tomato soup and the hermit cookie. Now the menu, along with the recipes, come from the cookbook School Lunches with Recipes to Serve 50 Children. That title, To Serve 50 Children, kind of reminds me of that Twilight Zone episode.
To serve, man, it's a cookbook!
But I assure you there are no children used as ingredients in either of these recipes. Rather, they are recipes for a lot of food to feed a lot of little kids. And I don't have any little kids around here, so I'm going to be cutting down the recipes. I'm going to make half of the cookies and just a quarter of the soup, and that's still enough soup to fill the biggest pot that I own. And so to make that soup, what you'll need is one number 10 can of tomatoes. This is a number 10 can of tomatoes. It's huge. It is 6 pounds, 6 ounces, or about 2.9 kilograms. The original recipe calls for 4 of these, so 1 is enough. 2/3 of a cup, or 75 grams of flour, 1 1/3 cup, or 340 grams of smooth peanut butter. Crunchy peanut butter, which I prefer, had come on the market just a couple years previous, but I'm guessing they used smooth peanut butter especially because it is a soup. Also, try to get it with no sugar added because they wouldn't have added a ton of sugar at the time. A half cup or 55 grams of chopped onions and 1½ teaspoons of salt. Then the recipe says to press canned tomatoes through a sieve to remove the seeds. So I tried this and it didn't work, at least not for me. I'd say that my sieve was too fine, but any less fine and the seeds would have gone through, so that doesn't make any sense. And maybe they pureed it beforehand, so that's what I ended up doing. You know, you just kind of got to make it work, I guess. But once you get smooth tomatoes, mix a cup of it with the flour and the peanut butter until it is as smooth as you can get. Then add the onions and the remaining tomato into a large pot and heat it until it starts to boil. Take a bit of that hot tomato and add it to the peanut mixture, stirring it all together, and then add all of that into the pot with the rest of the tomato. Stir in the salt, and then it says cook for about 10 minutes, stirring constantly. Now once you signed up for Wondrium and the soup is done, we can start making our cookies. The cookbook gives options for 3 different cookies: oatmeal raisin, molasses, and hermits, which I had never heard of. I guess they're actually still eaten in New England, but I had never heard of them, and everyone who does know of them says that they're pretty good, so I figured I'd give them a shot. So for that, you'll need a bowl to sift in 180 grams of flour with a 1/4 cup or 35 grams of dried skim milk, a 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, a 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Then whisk everything together and add a 1/2 cup or 240 grams of chopped raisins and toss them into the flour mixture, coating them well. A lot of recipes for these call for currants, which are a little bit smaller, and it kind of makes sense because chopping raisins is rather tedious. Then cream together a 1/2 cup or 113 grams of butter with 3/4 of a cup or 160 grams of light brown sugar. Then add 2 beaten eggs and mix until smooth. Then add the flour mixture and gently mix until just combined. Then scoop the dough out onto baking sheets. And since we know that this will make 25 cookies, we'll know exactly how big the cookies would have been in 1934, and spoiler alert, they're a lot smaller than most modern cookies. But even so, bake them at 375 degrees Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius for 8 to 10 minutes or until they start to brown on top. And while they bake, make sure you're subscribed to Tasting History, which if you think about it is a little bit like school lunch because 1, you learn how to make food, and 2, you get lessons like this one. So when that first school lunch happened is kind of hard to pin down. I mean, I'm sure somebody snuck some hummus and pita into one of Socrates' lectures. But when it comes to more of an organized school lunch, we have to look quite a bit later. Generally, it's accepted that it took place in Munich, Germany in 1790 when the American-born Benjamin Thompson, better known as Count Rumford, organized meals to be served to poor children before they took lessons. Though the children only spent half of the day in classes, they spent the other half making uniforms for the military, just like when I was in kindergarten. In France, school lunches started as gifts from private donors such as the author Victor Hugo, who sponsored an entire school. But in 1867, the Minister of Public Instruction, Victor Duruy, established the first widespread lunch program at over 460 schools. And a decade later, school canteens opened up all over Paris. And these were publicly funded programs that would give hot meals to all of the students. Those who could pay would, and those who couldn't got them for free. And even in the 1870s, the people setting this up knew that kids were bullies and would pick on those kids who got free lunches, and so they made a sort of ticket system so that everyone was anonymous. It was pretty cool. Similar programs came about in what's now Switzerland, Holland, and Germany, though in Germany, when a bill was introduced in the Reichstag in 1897 to provide school lunches in all cities, it was defeated because it was thought that free lunch would entice people to move into the already crowded cities. For a nationwide program, we must look to England, where the Parliament passed the Provision of Meals Act, which aims at securing that for this purpose, suitable meals shall be available just as much for those whose parents are in a position to pay as for those to whom food must be given free of cost. And the meals tended to be quite nice, always including some sort of dessert, like a gypsy tart, a Manchester tart, a treacle pudding, or spotted dick. And I'm assuming that the school children of England found the name just as funny as I did. Spotted dick. Now here in the good old US of A, it took us a little bit longer to get to a widespread lunch program, but there were local programs, like in 1853 when the Children's Aid Society of New York opened a vocational school for children living in poverty, and their attendance came with a meal. There were also penny lunches served in a handful of high schools in Philadelphia and Boston, and later in New York City there were 3 penny lunches because the cost of living in New York City is outrageous. But these programs didn't seem to take off. Most kids got their lunch by either going home at lunch and getting a meal there, or bringing their lunch like I did when I was a kid. But the problem with that is that it leaves a lot of people out, i.e. all of the parents that aren't at home at lunch, or the parents who can't really afford to give their kid a meal to take to school. Then in 1904, Robert Hunter published a book called Poverty, which among other things pointed out that there must be thousands, very likely 60 or 70,000 children in New York City alone who often arrive at school hungry and unfitted to do well the work required. He asked what's the point of truancy laws, which had become pretty standard, making the kids go to school if they are too hungry to actually learn while they're there. Also, I do think it's kind of funny that Robert Hunter, who spent his entire life concerned with poverty in America, ended up living in Montecito, California, which now is maybe the least impoverished place in the whole country. I mean, that's like the home of Prince Harry and Oprah. But it was because of that book and others from the time that there was a newfound effort to feed America's children. By 1912, over 40 cities had lunch programs, often making lunches in central kitchens, then delivering them to schools around the cities. But for those living in rural areas, a lot of the cooking was left up to the teacher. Enter the 1916 book The Rural School Lunch by Nellie Wing Farnsworth. She was of the opinion that the rural children actually had even a greater need for a hearty lunch than their city-dwelling counterparts, because the main meal on the farm was the midday meal, and while they were in school, they weren't at the farm to actually get it. Also, she says that they would have been extra hungry because many had to walk upwards of 6 miles uphill both ways in the snow. And she basically actually says that, and that's always what my grandpa used to say. I thought that was kind of funny. Also, during the winter, it might be so cold that should a child bring their lunch carried in a basket or pail, it is often frozen. When the pail or basket is opened, it is found to contain cold pancakes, salt pork, cold potatoes, pie, and bottles of cold tea or coffee. Yes, coffee. It was not uncommon to give children coffee at the time, and I'm going to guess that a room full of over-caffeinated 8-year-olds really makes a teacher's job all that much harder. So it was determined that children should neither drink tea nor coffee, but milk, water, or cocoa. Even cocoa should not be served every day, as it provides a stimulant to many children. But since the kids were arriving at school with frozen food, it was actually up to the teacher to prepare a hot meal. This meant that they had to stock their classroom with, among other things, a 2-burner blue flame oil stove, a portable oven, a frying pan, kettles, egg beaters, and a 2-quart double boiler. Now that is a lot on a teacher's salary, but Miss Farnsworth had a solution. One rural school teacher had a shower, like a baby shower, but for school lunch. She basically went to the stores in town and made up a list of all the things that she needed. She then sent invitations to all the mothers and women interested in the school, inviting them for a social afternoon and asking that each one bring with her one or more of the utensils which had been selected. And I would like to say that this is a relic of the past and how ridiculous, but since I come from a family of teachers, I know that it's not. Granted, it's not lunch and cooking items, but it is still like scissors and crayons and other things for the classroom that the teachers have to gather money to pay for. It's kind of ridiculous. Now, this book on rural school lunches really encourages that the kids eat together at a table rather than kind of going all over and eating, outside or whatever. This would encourage, among other things, better table manners. It would help their conversation skills, and my favorite reason, mothers will take more pains in putting up the lunch when they know that it is to be exhibited before the other pupils as well as the teacher. That is a mild public shaming to get mothers to send better quality lunches with their children. And so this was the status quo in the 19-teens and 20s, but then came the Great Depression. More children than ever were going hungry because their parents were all out of work, and so the parents couldn't afford the food that America's farmers were producing. So many problems, but one very elegant solution was school lunch. The New Deal allowed the federal government to buy up excess food from the country's farmers. Then they sent that food to school for children to eat, but instead of making the parents or teachers prepare the meal, they put those who were out of work into the kitchens, and thus was born the lunch lady.
It counts as a vegetable.
Now, one side effect of this program was that much of the food that the children began to eat was meat heavy, a lot more pork and beef, because it was those expensive ingredients that were in surplus. So our peanut butter and tomato soup was replaced with Salisbury steak.
Salisbury steak!
The American children were eating high on the hog, and then World War II happened. Surpluses turned into shortages, and schools were subject to the same rationing as everybody else. And the school lunch cookbooks from this period seem to include a lot of canned foods. It also saw just the actual number of school lunches really dwindle, and the effects of this were quickly evident. And so once the war was over in 1946, Congress passed the National School Lunch Act, since, as President Harry S. Truman said, "No nation is any healthier than its children or more prosperous than its farmers." So with decent budgets available for school lunches and school lunch infrastructure, the 1950s and 60s saw the cafeteria become the standard model for handing out school lunches to students. It's also when classic school lunch foods like pizza, fish sticks, and mashed potatoes served via ice cream scoop became popular fare. Of course, with public funds came a lot of lobbying on how to spend those funds, and so how students ate was largely determined by what companies had the most influence in Washington. And so the 1970s saw chips and candy bars and vending machines make their way into the cafetoriums of America. Nutritional guidelines started to dip, and by the 1980s, they fell off a cliff. And this is the area that gives rise to the idea that America once considered ketchup a vegetable, which isn't actually true. It turns out that it was probably just something that somebody said in a meeting, maybe in jest, maybe not, but never actually became public policy. But even so, school lunch became increasingly privatized and the portions shrank, yet the calories grew, mostly due to just more added sugar. And that's why my mom always made me take my lunch to school, which was okay as long as I had a really cool lunchbox. But then Lunchables got really popular, and that was the cool thing to bring, and they didn't fit in my really cool lunchbox. So on those few occasions when I could convince my mom to spend money and buy me Lunchables, I had to decide between the Lunchables and the cool lunchbox, and usually I went with the Lunchables in a brown paper bag. These were the things that made me lose sleep when I was 8. But in recent years, it seems that the quality of the food in school lunches has actually started to go back up, and there has been a concerted effort to make them more nutritional. But I think that we're still quite a bit behind most other countries, especially France, who has like full-on meals for the kids with beef bourguignon and brie on freshly baked baguette. And they do it at a lower cost than we do. It's crazy. I don't know how they do it. But, you know, I don't have any beef bourguignon today, nor fresh baguette, but I do have some peanut butter and tomato soup and hermit cookies about ready to eat. So once your cookies are cooled, slap together a butter sandwich with Wonder Bread and you're all set. And here we are, school lunch from the Great Depression. So I gotta say the texture of this doesn't look particularly appetizing. It's kind of gloopy, but it smells good, so let's give it a try. Oh, those poor children. Honestly, it's not even that it tastes bad, because it doesn't taste bad, but it doesn't taste good. I love tomato soup. I love peanut butter. Turns out those two flavors do not go well. They don't make a new flavor. It's more like tomato soup and peanut butter fighting against each other, and nobody wins. Hopefully the hermit cookie will be a little bit better. These smell really, really good. Let's give it a try. You can kind of tell from a cookie how it smells. Actually, that's really, really good. It reminds me of like the flavor of a fruit cake almost, but obviously not the texture. It's like a much softer, chewy texture. I've seen recipes where they kind of spread out more. It's probably just a different quantities of butter and everything in there, but this is more of a chewy cookie, which I really like. Delicious. A- to these. If they had chocolate in it, it would have been an A+. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. I'm gonna finish this right now. Today I'm going full lunch lady as I make sloppy joes. And not just any sloppy joes, because in a nostalgic effort to relive a moment of my blissful youth, I am making the quintessential middle school sloppy joes using the recipe provided to US school cafeterias in the 1980s and 90s. So thank you to Thrive Market for sponsoring this video because, to quote Cartman,
It's Sloppy Joe Day! It's Sloppy Joe Day!
this time on Tasting History. A few months ago, I made the rectangular pizza that they used to serve in school cafeterias for decades. And in that video, I mentioned that I got the recipe from the 1988 book Quantity Recipes for School Food Service, put out by the US Department of Agriculture. Well, I have rarely had such an enthusiastic response to a video, and I had literally thousands of people messaging me asking me to make other dishes from their own youthful school days. So I looked through the book, and it has many things that I remember from growing up in school, but I think the most quintessential is the Sloppy Joe. This is, after all, the star of Adam Sandler's 1994 song from Saturday Night Live called Lunch Ladyland, which featured Chris Farley as the lunch lady and Kevin Nealon as Sloppy Joe. Now, looking at the cookbook, most of the recipes are to feed 100 hungry children, and I think 100 Sloppy Joes at my age is just asking for a heart attack, so I am cutting this down to 10 Sloppy Joes. 8 would actually be better because hamburger buns come in packs of 8, but that math made some really weird quantities, so I'm doing 10. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 3/4 pound or 800 grams of ground beef. The book says no more than 24% fat, a heaping 1/4 cup of fresh diced onions, 3/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, 10 tablespoons or 160 grams of tomato paste, 10 tablespoons or 165 grams of ketchup, or catsup because they spell it catsup with a C, which always bugs me for some reason. 1 cup plus 2 tablespoons or 265 milliliters of water, 3 tablespoons plus 2 teaspoons of vinegar. And it actually doesn't say what kind of vinegar to use, but I asked a viewer who is a former lunch lady, and she said it was probably apple cider vinegar. Then 1½ teaspoons of dry mustard, 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper, 4 teaspoons of brown sugar, and 10 or 8 hamburger buns if you don't want to buy 2 packs. Now, I am very excited to try these Sloppy Joes, but I must admit they are not the healthiest food out there. In fact, looking through this cookbook, I realized most of the food that they were feeding us as kids was not very healthy. I remember I used to often have an entire lunch of just French fries and a Nutter Butter, which I could get away with when I was 12, not so much now that I am an adult. So I am trying to eat healthier these days, which is made easier with help from today's sponsor, Thrive Market. Thrive Market is an online grocery store that focuses in healthy and sustainable products. And it is a membership-based store online, but then many of the actual products are at a discount. They're less expensive than if you went and bought them in person. And one thing I love about Thrive Market is that you can sort your groceries by diet, whether you are vegan or gluten intolerant, low sodium, or like me, just trying to cut out some sugar. I, with my perpetual sweet tooth, have been trying to find some snacks that I can have during the day that are not just chock full of added sugar, especially high fructose corn syrup, and I have found many of those snacks on Thrive Market. My favorites are these mango and guava gummies that are just mango and guava. Those are the only ingredients, so all the sugar comes straight from the fruit, and orders over $49 ship for free, so it gets delivered to your doorstep. It's like having a bunch of health food stores all in one place. So to join Thrive Market today, then visit my link, thrivemarket.com/maxmiller, and you will get 30% off of your first order plus a free gift. That is thrivemarket.com/maxmiller. And now back to our Sloppy Joes. So the first thing to do is heat a pan over medium-high heat and then add in the ground beef. You want to start breaking it up, and the recipe simply says to brown the meat, which took me about 3 or 4 minutes. Once the meat is browned, drain off as much of the grease as you can. Then add the garlic powder and the onions and stir them in and continue to cook for another 5 minutes. And the recipe actually gives the option for dried onions, but I remember fresh onions being in it when I was a kid, so that's what I opted for. Plus, I love that it gives a note that you want mature onions. Produce after dark. After 5 minutes of cooking, add in the tomato paste, the ketchup, the water, and the vinegar, and stir it all into the meat and onions. Then add the dry mustard, the pepper, and brown sugar, and make sure everything is well mixed, and then reduce the heat to medium-low and let it simmer for 25 to 30 minutes. This was by far my favorite part of the process because 1, it smelled so good, and 2, I love the sound. A simmering pan of Sloppy Joe sounds just divine. I could probably start an entire channel of just ASMR cooking sounds, and this would be an entire video, I think. Just gurgling Sloppy Joe. Anyway, this recipe was, as I mentioned, for 100 students, which sounds like a lot, but it pales in comparison with another recipe that was put out for 6,000. This was part of an ad campaign in 1978 to promote McCormick Schilling's Sloppy Joe Spice Blend, and it featured a fictional army cook offering up my Sloppy Joe's recipe for 6,000. Brown 1,000 pounds of ground meat, mix in 1,000 packages of McCormick Schilling Sloppy Joe mix, and blend thoroughly. Stir in 1,000 6-ounce cans of tomato paste and 1,250 cups of water. Bring to a boil. Then reduce heat and simmer 10 minutes, stirring occasionally. Spoon over hamburger buns, makes 6,000 half-cup servings. To get 6 servings, divide by 1,000. Now obviously that recipe is tongue-in-cheek, but it does seem makeable, except for the fact that simmering that much meat for 10 minutes ain't gonna do a thing, considering our much smaller amount needs to simmer for 25 to 30 minutes, which is more than enough time to talk to you about the dubious origins of the Sloppy Joe. Who invented the Sloppy Joe? Well, I have to say, I believe that is an unanswerable question, because first you would need to define what is a Sloppy Joe. When the Sloppy Joe was supposedly invented in the 1930s or early 40s, the term Sloppy Joe could refer to a bunch of things, both sandwich and non-sandwich related. But let me tell you at least a couple of the theories of where the Sloppy Joe originated. Theory number 1 begins in Iowa with the loose meat sandwich, a terrible name for a sandwich. This is essentially a sandwich made of ground beef, but instead of forming it into a patty like a hamburger, it is left loose, hence loose meat. I think it just doesn't sound good and appetizing as a sandwich. Supposedly, it happened that one day a cook named Joe in either Sioux City, Iowa or Muscatine, Iowa was making one of these loose meat sandwiches and decided to add some tomato sauce, thus creating the Sloppy Joe, named after him because his name was Joe. So what of this story is verifiable and what is not verifiable? Well, first off, it was almost definitely not named after a guy named Joe. That's just not likely. But other aspects of the origin story are plausible. Things like the fact that it possibly came from Iowa and that it is a possible descendant of the loose meat sandwich. In fact, today there are places that call Sloppy Joes wet loose meat sandwiches, which is even worse. So in 1926, a man named Fred Angel, sometimes spelled with one L, sometimes two, opened a restaurant called Maid-Rite Sandwiches in Muscatine, Iowa. Well, by 1930, he had several shops, as well as several franchises, and had changed the name to Maid-Rite Hamburg Shop, which claimed to be the home of the Hamburg sandwich. Now, exactly what that sandwich was is in question. The only contemporary description that I could find came from a newspaper in 1931 that simply said that Maid-Rite hamburgers used choice beef, and once prepared, the meat is placed between a bun baked according to a special recipe. This bun is nearly 6 inches in diameter. In its entirety, the Maid-Rite hamburger is a delicacy to tempt the worst dyspeptic. So it's just not clear exactly what this sandwich was like. Later on, it definitely became known as a loose meat sandwich and became the loose meat sandwich. But was it that in the 1930s? I'm not sure, but let's just say that it was. Did someone working at one of these Maid-Rite shops put tomato sauce in there to make the first Sloppy Joe? Maybe, but they never told that story, and they never promoted anything like that. Until many, many years later, and even then, it wasn't under the name Sloppy Joe, so who knows? The thing is, there was a hamburger shop that did sell something called a Sloppy Joe. In 1944, in Coshocton, Ohio, 2 ads announced that Hap is introducing that new sandwich at the Hamburg Shop, Sloppy Joe's, 10 cents. Though it doesn't actually claim to have invented the sandwich, rather, it says that it originated in Cuba. Cuba? Well, that's a long way from Ohio or Iowa. And that brings us to theory number 2. Havana, Cuba was the playground for many Americans during Prohibition. If you were on the West Coast, you went to Tijuana to drink, but if you were on the East Coast, it was Havana, Cuba. And in 1928, American newspapers claimed that the best-known person in America is Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh, but the best-known person in Cuba is Sloppy Joe. His real name was Jose Abel, and he had emigrated to Cuba from Spain in 1904, and by the 1920s, he had a place called Sloppy Joe's, which was the place for Americans to drink when they went to Havana. And in the 1920s and 30s, they had an assortment of cocktails, but eventually, the sandwiches became more popular. Sloppy Joe's place is a big bar on a corner, and frankly, the best thing about it is the sandwiches they make. The bartenders are not front rank even by Havana standards. But just like the sandwich from Iowa, it's hard to say exactly what the sandwich was like in the 1930s. But they were definitely popular, as was the bar itself. It was mentioned in many, many newspapers around America, people going to Havana, Cuba, and one person that really loved it was author Ernest Hemingway. He was said to have encouraged his friend Joe Russell to rename his bar in Key West Sloppy Joe's, though some sources say the name change had nothing to do with the Havana bar, but rather because Joe's place was sloppy. They had a seafood bar set up where the melting ice just kind of made a slop on the floor. Regardless, they do now claim to serve the original Sloppy Joe sandwich, though since that claim didn't start until decades later, it's again impossible to say definitively if either the Cuban or the Key West bar actually invented the Sloppy Joe as we know it. And that is really the crux of the issue here, because what is the Sloppy Joe as we know it? Because in the 1930s and 40s, there were lots of sandwiches called Sloppy Joes that are nothing like the Sloppy Joe that we know. It just referred to any big sandwich with a lot of meat piled on it. One 1930s ad declares a hit for your party, the celebrated Sloppy Joe sandwich, a triple-decker sandwich of a whole loaf of Munchner rye sliced lengthwise and filled with ham, Swiss cheese, coleslaw, tongue, and Russian dressing. Serves for $1.25. It'd be like a $30 or $40 sandwich today, I swear. Another Sloppy Joe mentioned around this time came from Alabama, and it was said to have been named after a guy named Joe who invented the sandwich and then went off to fight in World War II, and that one was just ham and cheese. There was another from Kenosha, Wisconsin, which was roast beef and cheese, and that was sold at Sloppy Joe's Tavern. There were lots of sandwiches and restaurants called Sloppy Joe's all over the US, and Havana, I guess, at this time, so it's really hard to say who invented it, what the Sloppy Joe exactly was at that period, and so it's kind of a mystery. especially because Sloppy Joe didn't even just refer to sandwiches. It referred to a bunch of different things back then. There were cartoon characters named Sloppy Joe. People referred to their messy friends as Sloppy Joes. There was even an entire style of clothing called Sloppy Joe, and it was worn by women in the 1940s because all the guys went off to fight in World War II, and so women had to enter the workforce, and they realized that pants and loose-fitting clothes made life a lot easier. It also ended up becoming a popular style of dress for teenagers, but some people did not like this. In 1943, the Grand Rapids Press ran an article about how young women were dressing. There are the inevitable Sloppy Joe sweaters, dropping untidily around the figure, the unattractive, shapeless pleated skirts, usually uneven at the hemline, and the dirty saddle Oxfords they all wear. Now, you might be forgiven if you think that this is some old fuddy-duddy talking about women's clothes at the time, but no, it was actually a 17-year-old Gloria Jean who was a child and then teenage actress, and quite a judgy one at that. The style seems to have remained popular into the 1950s, but by 1954, it had started to die out. An article by a Mrs. Walter Ferguson was titled, "A Woman's View, Out with Sloppy Joe." News from all over says our schoolgirls are getting neater and sweeter. The Sloppy Joe fashion is out. The shirt tail and dirty sandal shoes are replaced by well-fitting skirts, sweaters, and blouses. I imagine the change in fashion will also bring about some changes in behavior. It's easier to act like a lady if one is dressed like a lady. And with the end of Sloppy Joe fashion, the term Sloppy Joe does seem to have only been used for sandwiches, specifically the type of sandwich that we think of today. By the 1950s, it was very, very popular, especially among the younger crowd. When the teenage gang descends on your home for eats, let it be Sloppy Joes, and plenty of them. And since it was the youth that enjoyed the Sloppy Joe, it's no wonder that it quickly became a staple of cafeteria food at schools. In 1957, a Canadian columnist came down to visit some high schools in the United States. She wrote that 2 high schools that I know about, West Palm Beach, Florida, and Buffalo, New York, serve Sloppy Joes regularly in their cafeterias. To see those American teenagers load their trays with Sloppy Joes and milk and banana cream pie was an experience full of chuckles and pleasure. That was Mary Moore, and she ended up publishing multiple recipes for Sloppy Joe sandwiches, all being ground beef with some form of tomato sauce, and they soon became popular with her Canadian audience. She spent the next decade sharing different recipes for Sloppy Joes with her audience, often with an idea of making them a little less sloppy. In 1962, she had a recipe for not-so-sloppy Joes that substitute a can of undiluted vegetable soup for some of the tomatoey ingredients in Sloppy Joes, and this makes it pretty. She also suggests that you eat it not with your hands, but with a fork and knife like civilized people should. Then in 1966, she really hit her peak in getting rid of the sloppy from Sloppy Joes in what she called Sloppy Joes Glamorized. In an article titled Silver Platter for Sloppy Joes, "Because I am commanded constantly by you to keep the Hamburg recipes coming, I gave Sloppy Joes some careful consideration because they are so popular with the Sloppy Jeans crowd. I have come up with a treatment of them tidied up for an economical guest dinner. Served in grand style on your best silver platter, your guests will forget they are eating Hamburg." A more complex and formal Sloppy Joe, a Sloppy Joseph, if you will. On the other end of the spectrum, you had the quest to make Sloppy Joes more casual and easier. Enter the Manwich.
What's a manwich?
In 1969, Hunt's created a canned sauce which included everything you need for a Sloppy Joe except for the meat and the bun. It took the cook time down to just a few minutes, long enough to brown the meat and heat the sauce. And they became very popular with their slogan,
A sandwich is a sandwich, but a manwich is a meal.
Sloppy Joes were now officially part of our culture, a staple of American cuisine. Even James Beard, the award-winning chef, had to, rather begrudgingly, affirm that Sloppy Joe is a product of the modern age, and though it is not a palate-tingling delight, it has a large following. As a kid who grew up in the 80s and 90s, Sloppy Joes were a big part of my diet, especially when I was at school. But also Sloppy Joes were like in the zeitgeist then. Mainly because of Adam Sandler, I feel. First, he had his song, Lunch Lady Land, on SNL, and then in 1995, he released Billy Madison, where the lunch lady made him extra sloppy because
I know how you kids like 'em sloppy.
And with that, it is time for me to try my own extra sloppy joes. So once the meat has simmered for a half an hour and most of the liquid has steamed off, they are ready to serve. The original recipe says to portion with number 12 scoop, 1/3 cup, onto bottom half of each roll. Cover with top half of roll. And here we are, sloppy joes from the school cafeteria cookbook of my childhood. I cannot describe just how good this smells. I wish I had the words. What I love is, I know you can't smell sweet, but it smells sweet. I think it's just like the ketchup. But then there is also that tang, that zing of the little bit of vinegar in there. It smells so good. Here we go. That is so good. I should have made 100, y'all. I could eat 100 of these. Not in one sitting. That's so good. Oh man. It tastes exactly like I remember it. It is the middle school version. And you want to get the cheapest possible hamburger buns that you can. Make them yourself, but don't get a fancy bun. You want the really cheap, like Wonder Bread style hamburger bun for this. It's so good. You gotta make it. It's so easy. If you remember these from your childhood, I think outside of America, I don't think they really have these. Maybe I'm wrong. But if you're American or Canadian and you grew up with these, you gotta try this because it's just so nostalgic and really, really good. So I'm actually going to finish this and a couple more because this is now my lunch because this is so good. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. If you grew up in the 80s and 90s here in the US, then you probably remember Pizza Day at school. For me, it was always on Fridays. And it wasn't just any pizza, but the iconic rectangular pizza that I'll be making today using the original recipe from 1988. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for keeping me flush with ideas for this channel as we go back to middle school for Pizza Day, this time on Tasting History. So I don't usually cover history from the 80s and 90s or anything that recent here on the channel, but when somebody posted on the Tasting History Reddit page the original recipe for this pizza that I so loved in elementary and middle school, I decided that I just had to make it. So this is an episode of Tasting My History. So the recipe comes from a 1988 booklet which was distributed to schools all over the US called Quantity Recipes for School Food Service from the United States Department of Agriculture. And it has recipes for all of your late 20th century school favorites like instant mashed potatoes, sloppy joes, or Salisbury steak, children.
It's Salisbury Steak Day.
But my favorite was the square pizza, or really rectangular pizza. And there are a few variations when it comes to how they made this pizza, the first being the crust. For pizza dough, use pizza crust recipe, see B14, or pourable pizza crust recipe, see B15. Pourable pizza crust, you say? Well, I am intrigued. Now, I don't know if my lunch lady used this recipe or if she did the regular pizza crust, but I want to make pourable pizza crust, so that's what I'm going to do. Now, the recipe calls for 100 servings. I don't need 100 servings of pizza, so I'm going to reduce it to 10 servings of pizza, for which you will need 2½ teaspoons or 7 grams of active dry yeast, 1 2/3 cup or 375 milliliters of warm water, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 2½ cups or 320 grams of all-purpose or bread flour, 3/4 of a cup or 55 grams of instant non-fat dry milk, 2 tablespoons or 25 grams of sugar, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1½ teaspoons of vegetable oil plus more for greasing the pan, and 1½ tablespoons or 15 grams of cornmeal. So first dissolve the dry yeast into the water and let it sit for 5 minutes. While it sits, add add the flour, dry milk, sugar, and salt in a stand mixer and mix using the whisk attachment on low for 4 minutes. I'm not sure exactly why it has you whisk it for so long at this point since there is no liquid in it yet, but that's what the recipe says, so that's what I'm doing. After 4 minutes, add the yeast, which should be nice and frothy, and the vegetable oil to the dough, or actually it calls it a batter, and continue to mix on a medium speed for 10 minutes. And while it mixes, you can get your pan ready. Now the recipe actually calls for 5 sheet pans, but sheet pans are actually massive. They're not going to fit in a home oven. So the ones that we use at home, even the large ones, are half sheet pans. So that's what I'm going to use, and I'm only going to use one of them, which will be for 10 servings. So coat the half sheet pan in a little more oil, and then sprinkle the top with cornmeal, trying to get it evenly distributed. Once the batter is ready, pour it into the pan and spread it out to cover the base. Now I really thought I screwed up here because there is no way that this amount of dough was going to cover the bottom of the pan, but I left it for a couple of minutes and it sort of relaxed and I eventually had a nice thin layer of dough all over. That's probably why the recipe says to let the dough sit for 20 minutes while you preheat your oven to 475 degrees Fahrenheit or 425 if you are using a convection oven. That's 245 degrees or 218 degrees Celsius for those of you not living in the US or in the other handful of countries that still uses Fahrenheit. I see you, my friends, in the Federated States of Micronesia. So once the dough is sat for 20 minutes, set it in the oven and bake for 10 minutes or 7 minutes if you are using convection. Now at this point the dough should be pre-baked. It's not fully baked through, but it's going to have some more time in the oven once we've added our toppings. And when it comes to toppings, we have a couple of options. There is the pizza with cheese topping and one for pizza with ground beef topping. Now maybe my school never had the ground beef topping, or maybe I just never got it. I can't honestly remember, but I do only remember eating this as a cheese pizza, so that's the one that I'm going to make. So for that, what you'll need is 1 tablespoon and 2 teaspoons or 12 grams of dried onions, a half teaspoon of garlic powder, a quarter teaspoon of black pepper, a half cup plus 2 tablespoons or 160 grams of tomato paste, 1 1/3 cups or 330 milliliters of water, 2 teaspoons dried basil, 2 teaspoons dried oregano, 1 1/2 teaspoons dried marjoram, a half teaspoon dried thyme, and 5 1/4 cups or 565 grams of mozzarella cheese shredded. If you do want to make the ground beef version, then just cut the amount of cheese in half and replace it with just under a pound of ground beef that you cook before putting it onto the pizza. But for the cheese version, you start by mixing the onions, garlic powder, pepper, tomato paste, water, and the seasonings in a saucepan, and then bring it to a simmer on the stove, and let it simmer for about 10 minutes. While it simmers, spread 1 1/2 cups of the cheese over the pizza crust, and then once the sauce has simmered for 10 minutes, pour that over the cheese, smoothing it out evenly. Again, it didn't really seem that there was going to be enough sauce, but there was, though as I spread it, I sort of messed up the cheese, and it seems that this was actually a problem even back in 1988, because in later recipes from the 90s, they just have you add that 1.5 cups of cheese to the sauce before putting it on. It probably makes it a lot easier. Once the tomato sauce is spread to the edges of the pan, sprinkle the remaining cheese evenly over the top. Now, if you recall, these pizzas did not have a crust around the edge like a round pizza, so you want to get the cheese all the way to the edge of the pan. Then pop that in the oven at 475 degrees Fahrenheit, 450 if you're using convection, and let it bake until it is lightly browned on top. The original recipe says it should bake for 15 to 18 minutes, but for me that was going to be way too long. It only took about 11 minutes to get brown on top, and I think that's just because I'm making 1/10 of the original quantity, so just keep an eye on it. Now there are 2 other interesting things in this booklet that I wanted to share. First are the garnishes. It gives instructions on how to make carrot ribbons or curls, celery fans, radish roses, onion mums, radish tulips, or a tomato rose. And personally, I don't ever remember my lunch lady making us any radish roses. And frankly, I think it's kind of unfair to expect an already very busy lunch lady or lunch man to make radish roses for a bunch of 6-year-olds. Kind of a waste of time, but if they did that at your school, let me know. The other interesting bit is that after each recipe, it tells you how much each serving of the dish equals servings of meat, vegetable, and bread. Like when it comes to our cheese pizza, not the meat pizza, but the cheese pizza, 1 piece provides the equivalent of 2 ounces of cooked lean meat, a 1/4 cup of vegetable, and 2 servings of bread. And that's really what school lunch was all about. It was making sure that the kids got enough servings of meat, vegetable, and bread, or nutrients in general. Or at least that was the goal, though it didn't always happen, as can be seen by the lunches of the late 20th century. Last year I did a video on the history of school lunch, and it focused mostly on the history pre-1960. So I decided that this would be a good chance to fill in some of the gaps post-1960. And the first thing that I found actually came from a comment left on that video about how the Black Panther Party influenced the school breakfast program. See, in the late 1960s, a study came out showing that kids who didn't have breakfast didn't do as well in school. They were tired, they would fall asleep, they couldn't concentrate. Kind of makes perfect sense, enough that you wouldn't even think you'd need a study to show you that, but they did. And it also showed that most of these kids were in poorer neighborhoods where they didn't have breakfast in the morning, usually because they couldn't afford it. So in 1969, the Black Panther Party started a program at a church in Oakland, California that provided free breakfasts to children who needed them. That first day, there were only 11 kids that showed up, but by the end of that first week, 135 kids were participating every day. The success of the program was so great that the party decided that they would have all of their chapters repeat it. So this breakfast program that the Black Panthers were doing was happening all over the country, and it got really, really big. So big that it grabbed the attention of the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who hated the Black Panthers. He hated pretty much everything. And this program that gave children free breakfast was so successful that Hoover decided it needed to be stopped. The program represents the best and most influential activity going for the BPP, and as such is potentially the greatest threat to efforts by authorities to neutralize the BPP and destroy what it stands for. Nice guy, that J. Edgar. He began a campaign that spread rumors that the Black Panthers were poisoning the breakfasts, and that didn't work. So instead, he just had police go in and bust the places up, destroying all of the food before it could be served to the kids. Unfortunately, it was effective, and it led to the program being discontinued and breaking up. But it had already become so popular that it couldn't go away. That program went away, but the kids' desire for breakfasts did not. So it gave a big boost to another program that had already been in effect since 1966 but hadn't really taken off. And that was a government-run program called the School Breakfast Program, which Congress permanently authorized in 1975. Though it also came under fire only 6 years later when big budget cuts hit the government, and it did stick around and is still around today, but even today it remains a political football. But it was during these budget cuts early on in the Reagan administration that led to another rather infamous lunch claim that the government was going to consider ketchup a vegetable. Now, how this came about was that during discussions at the USDA about how they could keep kids fed in light of these budget cuts to the school lunch program, they had a meeting where ideas could be freely tossed around. Anything goes. It was kind of one of those meetings where it's like, just say what you're thinking, there are no bad ideas. Well, one person had the idea to change the nutrition standards a little bit, which would allow relish and ketchup to be considered a vegetable. Now that was a bad idea, and unfortunately somebody wrote it down and it didn't get removed. Now it never actually became policy, but the whole ketchup is a vegetable thing did get out into the public, and there was severe blowback, rightly so. As one senator criticized, "This is one of the most ridiculous regulations I ever heard of, and I suppose I need not add that I do know something about ketchup and relish, or did at one time." And the reason he says that he knows something about ketchup and relish is that that senator was Henry J. Heinz III of the Heinz ketchup family. But officially, the government never actually considered ketchup to be a vegetable. That is not to say that there were not other dubious claims made to the school lunch program. Going back all the way to 1975, there was a pilot program started first in Las Vegas, and then that spread to New York, Milwaukee, and several other cities, where schools began changing their lunch menus to more mimic the fast food that was becoming popular with the students. This led to menus with beef and cheese tacos, cheese pizzas, a meat and bean-filled burrito, a corn dog, fried chicken, and all-beef hamburger. Hard-boiled eggs, cottage cheese, and a chef's salad are also available. They also had a new alternative to milk, which the USDA signed off on as an approved alternative to milk, and it was called the Super Shake, which was essentially a milkshake, but they didn't use ice cream. But it did use emulsifiers and stabilizers that impart the creamy texture. The finished shakes are 96.75% fat-free, which would not be possible if they were made with ice cream. To meet the requirement of kids needing to have a vegetable on their plate, they gave the children two options: a salad or French fries. And not shocking to anyone, the number of students choosing salad over fries has to be considered negligible. The thing is, these were actually the healthy meals. These were the meals that hit all the standards that would allow them to be reimbursed by the US government. But there were other meals being offered that did not meet these standards. And so many students were seen taking lunches such as 2 cinnamon buns and a Coke, 4 sugar cookies and Sprite, 2 bags of French fries and a milkshake, or simply a glass of soda. And yet, even with these criticisms, the Las Vegas high school lunch was superior to most of the 135 sampled around the country several years ago. But neither the fast foodification of the 1970s nor the budget cuts of the 1980s would compare to what happened to school lunches in the 1990s, when I was eating them. See, in the 1970s, they tried to mimic the fast food of the time. But in the 1990s, new regulations were put in that let the fast food companies just come right on into the schools. There were branded products from McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Pizza Hut, you name it, it was there. Now, not every school had this. My school never did, and at the time, we kids did not like that. But in hindsight, probably a good thing. But by the year 2000, 1 out of 5 schools in the US had some of these branded products. Now, it does seem that the late 90s and early 2000s were kind of the worst period nutritionally for American school lunches, with about 35% of the calories coming from fat. But eventually, schools began to fight back. Even when I was in high school, there was a push to get rid of the vending machines, and they either got rid of them while I was there or just after. I can't really remember. Anyway, in the last couple of decades, there has been an effort to make school lunches here in the US more nutritious, and in some places they certainly have. But it is still definitely a point of contention and political debate. But that is food present, and I am all about food history. So let us travel back in time to 1988, when a 5-year-old Max walked into Madison Heights Elementary to try his first slice of square pizza. So once your pizza has baked, take it out of the oven and cut it into slices. I had planned on doing 10 slices, but it turns out cutting that into 10 was going to be kind of wonky, so I cut them into 9. And here we are, school lunch from 1988. So it smells just like it did 30 some odd years ago. Let's see if it tastes that way too. Memories from the corners of my mind. That's my best Barbra Streisand. Tastes just like it. You can, like, all of those herbs are exactly the same as they were. I think maybe it tastes a little fresher than I remember. Like, the flavors are a little heightened, but that's them. This is the pizza. And that's the dough. That pourable dough. That must be what they were using at my school, because that is the dough. I also love that today I would never think of drinking chocolate milk with pizza, but in middle school, I always had chocolate milk with pizza. They were smaller. I searched for a carton that was smaller, and I couldn't find it. I was told by my sister, who recently stopped teaching elementary school, that her school still has the little cartons, and that I should just go to an elementary school and ask for a carton, but I thought that might be weird, so I got a big one. It's good. Still goes with pizza. I should have made all 100 slices. So if you are nostalgic for this pizza, might I suggest you make it? It's pretty cool to taste this flavor, because I don't think they make it anymore, at least not like this at schools. And kudos to all of the lunch ladies and lunch men out there today and from my past. They do They do the good work. Oh, also, something that my sister reminded me of about the chocolate milk. Does anyone else remember there was a period of like 1 or 2 years in many schools where they switched from the cartons to these bags of milk, either regular or chocolate milk, and it was like a clear bag. It was like a bladder of milk. It was kind of gross. You just stuck the straw in like a Capri Sun, but on its side. Does anyone remember that? Because I remember it, she remembers it, but none of our friends seem to. So we were thinking maybe we were crazy. Anyway, let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.